Mum, are you using the car today? Oh, Dad already has it. Well, I need to get to work. Dad didn't tell me he was using it. When will he be back? In half an hour. I need to be at work in half an hour. Can you drive me with the other car? No, I can't drive myself with that one. I'm not insured on it because I'm still on my P's, remember? Plus it's way too big and I've never parked with that thing. The next bus isn't for ages. I'm going to be late for work. Let me call Dad. For me, this conversation was a frustratingly common part of my young adult life when negotiating the transport options in Wamuran, my rural hometown in southeast Queensland. To many of us, car use has offered freedom and personal autonomy, yet at the same time cars have forced us to juggle our lives around them, their availability, our ability to drive them, and the infrastructure that upholds them. This is just one idea that is central to automobility, a concept that explains how our societal structures and cultural norms prioritise car-based transport. The expectation that everyone simply drives is even more prominent in rural and regional Australia. The Caboolture to Wamuran rail trail is challenging this. After its opening in 2020, this nearly 11-kilometre long sealed shared path became much more than what council representatives and transport planners intended for it to be. My research took me on a journey back to my hometown of Wamuran to ask, in what ways did automobility inform the vision, planning and design of the rail trail and shape the assumptions of how it might be used? How has the rail trail been used since its opening and what meanings are associated with these uses? And what does this all tell us about the potential for rail trails to shift transport planning approaches in rural and regional areas? Through qualitative interviews and observations, I found that the rail trail was planned and designed first and foremostly for recreation and tourism. However, its uses have exceeded these expectations. Locals are using and ascribing their own meanings to it, some of which include staying fit and healthy, remaining independent, giving back to the community by teaching others to ride, advocating for car-free transport options, appreciating nature while commuting to work, connecting with grandkids, making new friends, or strengthening existing ones. My findings highlight that assumptions around car use in regional areas may not always hold true, and that engaging with communities must be the cornerstone of any transport planning process if we want to move away from and reframe car dependency in regional areas. And this might even start with a rail trail. Thank you.
What is the first thing that comes to mind when you see this image? Or when I mention CrossFit? Well, for me, I felt intimidation, fear, disconnect, and something that closely resembles a cult? Well, CrossFit is a group-oriented fitness activity incorporating both weightlifting and gymnastics into one session. Sounds like fun, right? Well, you might now be thinking, what does this have to do with urban planning? Well, CrossFit, from my research, is less about what this guy is doing and more about what I'm doing right now. Talking, conversation, connection, and ultimately, community. A sense of community is a feeling of belonging and support, created through a close relationship with one another. A community builder is therefore a location or an activity where a sense of community is created. Previous research has shown that developing a sense of community can influence the perception of one's urban environment, increasing feelings of safety and connection to place. However, many CrossFit sites are located within industrial estates, not commonly associated with creating community. Therefore, my research will focus on how does CrossFit act as a community builder, aiming to investigate CrossFit through two domains. 1, CrossFit as an activity, and 2, CrossFit as a location. Through 12 interviews across 8 different CrossFit sites involving a mixture of CrossFit gym members, trainers, and owners, I found that CrossFit's activity domain was highly influential in creating a sense of community, attracting an affluent but demographically diverse participant from all fitness levels. This community was bounded together through an identity based on proximity, support, and a strong CrossFit owner leadership. Some locations described how this connection was an opportunity for business networking, acting to support a sense of entrepreneurship. Investigating CrossFit as a location was also found to not influence one's sense of community, as it wasn't necessarily tied to the elements of its physical site. However, there was a drive within some inner city locations to be better places and actively incorporate an industrial heritage, adaptive reuse, and cafes within their facility. This showcases how CrossFit has a potential role within urban renewal, but also gentrification, especially considering its high membership prices, financially limiting participation. This research recommends that community builder locations like CrossFit be better planned for and protected, especially considering their adaptive reuse and broad social appeal. Now, have I convinced you to join the CrossFit cult? Sorry, I mean community? Thanks.
Laneways. What comes to mind when we think of laneways? Some of us think of pockets between buildings filled with cafes and restaurants. Some of us think of smelly dumpsters and car garages. I often think of them as mysterious streets designed by urban planners who really likes puzzles. You may have come across research and news articles about laneways in the city. What's puzzling is residential laneways are often left out of these discussions. My thesis research is about bridging this gap. My research questions are asking who control these residential laneways and what can be done to revive them. And in doing so, I'm exploring the relationship between urban narrative and urban placemaking. Think of it as Melbourne's way of storytelling, where the main characters are not just the people, but also the street themselves. Urban placemaking is about giving these laneways a makeover, except for the lanes that are the main characters. Urban narrative is about giving these laneways a personality redemption arc, whether they're the main characters or not. Residential laneways in Melbourne are governed by the council and the residents. The council typically cares more about laneways that are the main characters, while the residents want to revive these laneways regardless if they're the main characters or not. So I try to find out how this relationship works. I started out by mapping laneways within my study area, which is in Brunswick and Fitzroy. I also started looking at policies to see what the councils have done to manage them. Topping it all off, I did site visits to confirm and debunk data I found from the policies and the maps. What I have found out is that residential laneways within my study area make up 26% of total road network's length and land parcels that remained unused and abandoned. What I also found out is no one really controls these residential laneways. So it makes it hard to implement policies without conflicts between what the residents need and what the councils want. Instead of making policies that favor car access through these residential laneways, make ones that favor pedestrians and cyclists access through these laneways. Instead of looking at laneways from above like most councils do, look at them from the bottom up, like the residents that use them do. These would naturally bring in human traffic through these lanes, and like the esteemed architect and urban designer Yan Gel once said, if you design streets for people to cycle and walk, it will naturally bring life into the city. So the next time you find yourself in these laneways, especially the ones behind your house, don't think of them as useless spaces. Think of them as gems, ones that are hidden behind plain sight.
I acknowledge the deep connection between the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples and their ancestral country which has always known the Woiwurrung language. We can see it in place names around us: Mary, Naarm, Darebin, Birrarung. Through colonisation, many places had their names erased. But this is where place name decolonisation comes in, restoring Indigenous names or introducing new ones. This practice actually has a long history in Victoria, from post offices in the 1800s having their vulgar European names replaced with more melodic sounding Indigenous ones, or the Grampians becoming Grampian Scarry Word in the early 90s as a way to attract more tourism. In recent years, we're seeing more of these renamings, largely led by local councils, which made me ask, what drives them to engage in place name decolonisation? I interviewed councillors and officers at Marybeck Council, which changed its name from Moreland, and Hepburn Council, which changed the name of Jim Crow Creek to the Djadjawurrung language Lani Barramul. Both previous names had racist connotations, and both had actually been brought to council's attention in the past, without follow-up. So what changed? Well, my interviewees framed place name decolonisation as part of their larger reconciliation efforts. So these councils started making statements of commitment, establishing reconciliation committees, appointing reconciliation officers, and it meant that when these issues came up again, they felt that addressing it was non-negotiable. This also helped answer my second question: how do councils engage with their communities on these issues? Place name changes can spark a lot of resistance, as it relates to people's place identity. Both councils prioritised educating the community about the significance of the name change and ensuring the safety of the local Indigenous community. Neither council allowed the community to debate whether the name should be changed or ask them to suggest names. Both had information campaigns, including reports by historians into the background of the names. However, both councils also talked about what a huge undertaking the process was, in terms of time, resources, and costs. This raises issues with the viability of place name decolonisation, and my recommendations include updating the Victorian naming rules to reduce the administrative burden for councils. To end on a positive note, my research has highlighted the strong relationships the councils already have with Indigenous communities, and has underscored the importance of councils having reconciliation measures in place if they wish to engage in place name decolonisation.
Let's start with a question. Raise your hand if you walked, took PT, or drove to uni today. Now keep your hand up if you think you risked your life by coming here today. No one? That's pretty standard, right? It's a normal commute. Well, out of all the women I interviewed, each one worried about dying each time they took to the seat of their bike. Half the women were expected to text their loved ones once they arrived safely from their cycling commute. Despite it being more likely to die walking than cycling, for women, the perceived probability of death was real. No other form of transport requires this amount of risk. But for women, it is their lived reality. My thesis is female psychology. Yes, a play on words. Understanding the influence of cycling infrastructure on the lived experiences of female cyclists in Melbourne. In Melbourne, local councils have reduced the complexities of the barriers females face in cycling to one sole solution: bike lanes. My thesis has sought to understand what role infrastructure plays relative to other factors, such as meaning, materials, and skills and knowledge, in shaping the lived experience of female cyclists. I operated with the research question of, how do women's navigation of cycling infrastructure in Melbourne shape their lived experience? I conducted 11 interviews with female cyclists and applied a social practice theory framework to data. Social practice theory asserts 3 tenets, comprised of meaning, materials, and skills and knowledge. And these 3 tenets overlap like a Venn diagram to form a practice. My research uncovered 3 key findings that shed new light on existing literature. First, the role of infrastructure is inherently connected with meaning, materials, and skills and knowledge, and further, is framed as a sociocultural product. In Melbourne, cycling infrastructure was found to reinforce gendered hierarchies of power. Second is regarding commute versus recreational rates of cycling. Australia is characterised by high rates of recreational cycling and low rates of commuter cycling. However, in this study, only 1 out of 11 participants cycled for recreational purposes. This was linked to cycling infrastructure creating more stresses than it actually alleviated for participants. And third, cycling spaces for the acquisition of skills and knowledge, such as cycling shops, were found to be places viewed as hostile, demeaning, male-dominated, and intimidating spaces. This acted both as a barrier to entry for cycling, but also in the longevity of participation for female cyclists. So why is this significant? I found in my research that cycling as a practice is a microcosm for what it is like to be a woman in public life today. Cycling and gender is not a one-directional relationship. Just as cycling is shaped by gender, cycling is also the site for the production of gender. Cycling infrastructure is only one factor in the lived experience of female cyclists. An increasing cycling participation and accessibility to cycling for females cannot be achieved through infrastructure alone. Meaning, materials, and skills and knowledge must all be addressed holistically in policy. Thank you.
What do you see when you look at this image? I see a lot of houses. I see a lot of cars. But I don't see many people. And I definitely don't see many people walking in the streets. Jane Jacobs once said that if you want people to walk, they need a place to walk to, like the local shops and retail areas. When I look back at this image, I don't see many places that people could walk to, and I definitely don't see many shops. My research looks at these elements and tries to understand how we should be planning our communities to improve walkability based on how we plan for commercial areas. My research argues that the way we plan for commercial areas can influence walkability based on its structure and size. My research spatially analysed land use data from 10 case studies within Greater Melbourne. The data focused on the overall structure of the commercial areas within each case, which was coded to be either a linear structure, such as shopping strips that you might see on Sydney Road or Chapel Street, or cases of a clustered structure, which is more like shopping centres, like what you see at Chadstone or Fountain Gate. My study also looked at whether the overall size of commercial area influenced walkability, such as if we had one little section of shops to cater for thousands of houses. Is that enough commercial area to achieve walkability? Using this data, I then measured walkability based on how many residents could access their local shops within a 10-minute walk from home. My results found two key findings: that when it comes to neighbourhood walkability, both commercial area structure and size matter. My results found that commercial areas with a more linear structure had greater walkability than those that were in a clustered structure. I also found that cases that had more commercial area in their boundary had greater walkability compared to those with a small amount. Interestingly, the best results were found when the cases had both a structure that was linear and also large in the amount of commercial area allocated. The worst results were when the size was high, but in a clustered structure. My findings suggest that the way we plan for new communities needs to be revised from the current status quo of a sea of residential area to interweaving commercial area back into the community and prioritising this in land use budgeting to allow enough for it to cater for the whole community, not just the lucky few. By making these changes, we can make walkability a priority. And as planners, this can start by changing the way that we plan for commercial areas. Thank you.